friends, welcome back to Fantasy Wash. Today we are going to be talking about Fourth Wing, so settle in. There has been a lot of conversation that has been happening around Fourth Wing on the booktube community and pretty much on the internet in general. If you are part of the booktube community, meaning that you go onto YouTube and you look at book content, chances are you have encountered Fourth Wing. Also, if you are familiar with what book talk is, you are definitely familiar with Fourth Wing, and if you have been to the fantasy section of your local bookstore in the last 9 months, chances are you've seen Fourth Wing and Iron Flame by Rebecca Yarros. First book of the series, Fourth Wing, initially gained popularity on Book Talk, which is TikTok's version of BookTube, and it became a massive hit, a massive sensation. However, as things do when they get popular, in addition to having a very strong fan base and following, there was a very strong opposition that was following to it. In terms of seeing cycles happen like this with books before in my lifetime, the biggest example I would probably give would be Twilight. I grew up with the Harry Potter phenomenon, but most people got on board with that train. There wasn't quite the opposition to that as there is with Fourth Wing, but there was with Twilight in that it was sappy, the writing wasn't good, it was just meant for young girls, and it wasn't intellectually stimulating. This conversation kind of resurfaced when Fourth Wing started making the rounds of the booktube community. I am not gonna give myself praise here where I do not earn it, and I am definitely part of the problem. I had conversations with people, specifically, let me cue a clip with Jimmy Nuts.
Barnes & Noble a few weeks ago, and this girl was wandering around the fantasy section aimlessly, and I looked at her and I saw what she was carrying, and I was like, I really don't want you to read that. Please read these things instead. Didn't say that to her, but was like, if you're interested in fantasy, let me tell you about blah, 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 blah. And this poor girl was like, I just saw this book on Book Talk and thought it looked interesting. I was like, you have a great night now. I've just like yammered at you for the last 5 minutes.
Was it Fourth Wing?
It was Fourth Wing, and she had Iron Flame in the same pile. And
it is clear that I felt I was intellectually above Fourth Wing. Why I felt this, I'm not really sure. It's probably due to the fact that the algorithm kept feeding me video after video saying, worst book of 2023, or worst book I've ever read, or, you know, Fourth Wing is expletive. And I didn't feel like it was a story that was worthy of my time, because our time is limited and precious, especially when you are an adult, you're busy, you have kids. You do not we value our time in such specific ways that why would we want to waste it on something that we feel we're probably not going to like, especially when it's coming from voices that we typically value and trust. However, I recently came across a video by a booktuber who I am generally very in line with, and that is Kronk the Book Guy, and he did a phenomenal video on Iron Flame and Fourth Wing and why it is worth the hype. And if you're not following Kronk the Book Guy, you definitely should be, because he is your nonstop shop for all unbiased fantasy SFF content in general. He's great. Highly recommend you check out his channel, which I will link. But he was saying that as a community, we've really been gatekeeping Iron Flame and Fourth Wing. And why is it that we're doing that? And I sat back and I thought about it, and I thought, okay, I could be part of the problem where I can continue to talk about something that I have zero vested interest in and I don't really actually know the foundation of the story, or I could read it and then I could talk about it even if it is problematic still. So naturally I went with the latter, because I love to talk about things and I love to be educated on what I'm saying. And I am here to drop the spoiler bomb that Fourth Wing is not that bad. However, as I read Fourth Wing, which I will say I read in a very quick period of time. I think I read it over the course of 2 days. It's an easy read, and there's things that we're going to digest about it a little bit as our conversation goes on. I found very strong parallels between other YA and young adult fantasy fiction to Fourth Wing, but we're not talking about it in the same way, and I thought that that was something that was really interesting. The story itself for Fourth Wing, like I said, is fine. It's not the worst thing I've ever read. The prose are not groundbreaking. There are a few cringy moments. However, Yarros has done a decent enough job in that she has developed named characters that are interesting. There is good representation of LGBTQ characters, disabled characters. It feels like a world that is semi-lived in. It can definitely be fleshed out. This is supposed to be a 5-book series, so there is room to expand on that. Her magic system with the connection to the dragons is really interesting and how it influences the writer. It's there. The foundations are there. But what's different from Yaros's writing compared to something like The Hunger Games is that we are using sex often in the storyline. Now, fantasy, when we think about classical fantasy and high epic fantasy, traditionally fantasy has not had much romance in it. There might be little minor subplots where a character has a vested romantic interest in another character. However, that hasn't really been at the forefront of our stories. If we think about Lord of the Rings or Narnia, we're not really thinking about, oh, what is the relationship between these characters? We're thinking about the fact that Sam and Frodo, because let's be real, Sam is really the hero of that story, are taking the ring to Mordor. In addition to, we're thinking about the Pensieve children and overcoming the White Witch or the development of Narnia. We're really immersed in the story as a whole. But fantasy over the last few decades really has been starting to incorporate more romance into its narratives. And I think that has a lot to do with the fact that as a whole, more female readers are picking up fantasy. Now, traditionally, when we think of romance genres have been targeted towards women. And now that we have women and younger girls leaning into fantasy, we are trying to incorporate both of these themes, and we now have the new subgenre, romantasy. Now, Fourth Wing was kind of at the front of this charge last year. It even was nominated for Goodreads Romantasy Novel of the Year. So romantasy is here to stay. There clearly is enough of a market for it that it is going to be around for a while. If we look at how many reviews there are on Goodreads for Fourth Wing in comparison to The Hunger Games, it's kind of staggering when you think about how many years ago The Hunger Games came out versus how recently Fourth Wing came out. But I was really interested in this because when we think about the conversation and the discourse that happens around The Hunger Games, people revere The Hunger Games as being a really positive YA dystopian, albeit, but positive series in that the protagonist is a strong female character, Katniss Everdeen, and the story itself is gripping. However, the themes and ideas and tropes were not original in The Hunger Games, and they're not original in Fourth Wing, but they are similar, and they're not the only ones like this. When I was digging and doing my further analysis, I was comparing not only The Hunger Games and Fourth Wing, but then I started my comparison as well to the Grishaverse by Leigh Bardugo. So we have Hunger Games, Suzanne Collins, we have Rebecca Yarros and Fourth Wing, and then we have Leigh Bardugo, Grishaverse. Each of these books has a young female protagonist that is somewhere in her late teens to early 20s, and she is starting off with some sort of disadvantage in life. In the case of The Hunger Games, Katniss Everdeen comes from the poorest district. In the case of Fourth Wing, we have our protagonist Violet, who suffers from a disability, a physical disability, which Rebecca Yarros herself suffers from, and it is EDS. And then when we look at Alina Starkov, she is very sickly. None of these characters are coming from a positive circumstance and vantage point. They're being thrust into a situation that they themselves do not want to be in. Fourth Wing commences with Violet being thrown into this academy in a quadrant that she does not want to be involved in, and that is the Dragon Riders quadrant. And that is a death trap. And as I was reading this, it was so similar in so many ways to the interactions between characters and contestants in The Hunger Games. And I kept going back to this in the sense that we have 3 relatively strong female characters, but the main difference is that whereas Hunger Games does have relationships, we have the little love triangle between Peeta, Katniss, and Gale, and we have a love triangle in Fourth Wing between Violet, Xaden, and Dean, and there is a love triangle in the Grishaverse between the Dark One, Alina, and Mal. The real difference is that Fourth Wing leans into its expletive content, and it is very pro-sexuality, and its language is a bit grimier than the other two novels. Now, I found this interesting because it's really an awkward book to place. The book itself has quite a bit of cursing in it, and at times I didn't feel that this was actually necessary. I didn't feel that it added much to the plot, but the way that Rebecca Yarros actually writes sex scenes, I deem to be quite positive. In a lot of our other fantasy worlds, we often, if we do have a sex scene, have it from the perspective of a male character, and therefore it's focused on them. And in this case, we are actually seeing it from a female's perspective, where the language she's using for anatomy is often appropriate, and there is good sensuality happening in these scenes. So why is it that we have deemed something unworthy or unintellectual because it has sexual content in it? That is what I am most curious about. When I look at what has been adapted over the last several years, we had the Hunger Games films. We actually just had a new Hunger Games movie come out this past year, and Fourth Wing itself is going to be adapted by Amazon going forward. And it's clear that there is a demographic for this, and we shouldn't be labeling it as less than simply because it includes sexual content and relationships. I am the first one to admit that I do not love romance in my fantasy. It's not generally where I lean into, so this was an interesting reading experience for me. However, I sometimes like to get on a hype train and see what all the fuss is about. I did read Twilight back in the day. Was it my favorite? Absolutely not. But I will say there were parts of Fourth Wing that I genuinely did enjoy, and I want to tell you about them now. The plot overall I thought was relatively interesting. Violet is 20 years old. She is entering this academy and has been trained her entire life to be a scribe due to the fact that she is sickly and has issues with her joints and her muscles. However, after the death of her elder brother, her mother has decided, who is one of the runners of this school, that she is going to be a dragon rider. She is not going to be a scribe. And dragon riders have to go through test after test after test. And it's similar to the Hunger Games in that you are almost trying to take out your competition because there are only a certain number of dragons that are willing to bond with humans every single year. And there's usually more humans than there are dragons. So in addition to dealing with physical contests, you are dealing with mental contest against your actual competition that you are with every single day. Now, Yarros did an interesting job at setting up different parts of the school, how it runs, how it functions. The characters themselves are not the most in-depth that we have ever gotten, but I feel like I know several of them pretty well at this point. Like I said earlier, there's good representation in this book. I felt like the language at times was a little misplaced, a little cringy in terms of the way that she is describing the way that she views her crush. Found that a little bit awkward. But I will say that even for someone who doesn't like romance, I think she did a good job with the sexual content in her books. I give her full credit for that. I thought that the magic was really interesting. I'm curious to see where it goes. And in all seriousness, I am genuinely interested in continuing on with the series. Is it the best thing that I have ever read? Absolutely not. Is it the worst thing that I have ever read? Absolutely not. But does that matter? And the answer is no. The fact that we are gatekeeping this book, seemingly because it is a book that has been written for young women and younger girls, is highly problematic. And it makes me question why it is that BookTube as a whole and the bookish community is doing this. You don't have to like something. It doesn't have to fall into your wheelhouse, and that's okay. I know people that don't love Circe, which I have on my shelf behind me. It's one of my favorite books. Does it mean that I think less of them or they think less of me? No, but we are allowed to enjoy what we enjoy. So this is just a fun little reminder to think about what it is that we're reading. Why is it that someone is telling you that you maybe shouldn't read that, and why it is less than? And maybe endeavor to go out and read that thing and see if that is actually the case for you. Because I thought I was better than this book, and I definitely wasn't. And that was a big mistake that I won't make again. If you'd like to follow along and see more videos from me, you can hit like and subscribe. And as always, you can follow me at Instagram if you want to keep up with what I'm reading currently at Fantasy Wash. And let me know down in the comments if you read Fourth Wing and what your relationship is with it. I'll see you next time. Bye.